The ambulance doors slam shut. I'm holding the folder that could save Leo's life. But the transport team doesn't know the truth yet. If I don't stop them in the next 5 minutes, that biopsy will kill him. The hospital COO suppressed the genetic report to protect her grant. My hands shake as I dial the medic's number, praying he answers before the scalpel does. Too late. The fluorescent lights in the medical records room didn't just hum. They vibrated with a low-frequency B-flat that David Miller felt in the marrow of his teeth. It was 3:14 a.m. The air in the windowless basement smelled of scorched dust and the metallic tang of old filing cabinets. On his monitor, the genetic markers for 4-year-old Leo Taylor glowed like jagged neon constellations. David's eyes were bloodshot, his vision blurring at the edges. But the data was undeniable. Leo didn't have a simple bruise on his thigh, and his father hadn't struck him. The boy's collagen was failing. It was Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, a systemic collapse of the body's internal scaffolding, disguised as routine injury. David leaned over the cramped nursing station, his shoulder brushing against a stack of discarded intake forms that crinkled like dry leaves. His pulse was a frantic hammer against his fingertips. If the state transport team moved Leo now, the friction of the gurney alone could tear his skin like wet tissue paper. An invasive biopsy would be a death sentence. The boy would bleed out before the surgeons could even find the source of the leak. "Type faster," David whispered, his voice raspy from lack of sleep. Maria Rodriguez, the night shift nurse, didn't look up. Her rings clattered against the keyboard in a frantic, uneven rhythm. Her brow was furrowed, carving deep, anxious lines into her forehead that caught the harsh overhead light. Maria was a woman who said sorry to inanimate objects when she bumped into them, a soul burdened by a lifelong guilt she couldn't name. But tonight, she was focused. "The security hub keeps bouncing the request," Maria muttered, her breath smelling of peppermint gum and stale coffee. "If Jennifer Sterling catches us using an administrative override, we're both collecting unemployment by dawn, or worse." "They're taking him to a facility that doesn't have a vascular unit, Maria. He won't survive the hour if we don't stop that transport. The bruises aren't evidence of a crime, they're evidence of a catastrophe." Maria bit her lip, a nervous twitch David had seen through 100 double shifts. She jammed the enter key with a final, desperate thud. A green progress bar flickered to life, illuminating the dark circles beneath her eyes and the silver crucifix around her neck. "Codes are live. You have 5 minutes before the system triggers a manual reset. Go." David grabbed the printed bypass slip. The paper was warm from the printer, sharp and stiff in his grip. He didn't wait for her to finish her warning. He pivoted, his rubber-soled shoes squeaking on the linoleum as he lunged toward the heavy double doors. The hospital felt like a labyrinth designed by a sadist. The white walls so bright they felt aggressive, stripping away any sense of privacy. Every second stretched. Somewhere deep in the bowels of the building, the hydraulic hiss of the loading dock echoed, a sound like a giant beast exhaling. It was the signal. The ambulance was there. He burst through the final set of swinging doors, the cool, damp air of the night hitting him like a physical blow. The loading dock was a cavern of concrete and rusted iron, smelling of exhaust fumes and industrial bleach. The ambulance sat idling, its red and blue lights painting the gray walls in rhythmic pulses of emergency. David's lungs burned as he sprinted across the asphalt. He could see the transport team, 2 men in dark uniforms, sliding the gurney toward the open rear doors of the vehicle. Leo looked tiny under the white sheets, a pale ghost of a child. "Wait!" David shouted, his voice cracking. "Stop the transport." He was 20 feet away when a shadow detached itself from the brick pillar near the bay doors. It wasn't a guard. It was a man in a tattered flannel shirt, his face a mask of jagged desperation and raw grief. Mark Taylor, the father. He had escaped police custody, and his eyes were fixed on David's white lab coat with a terrifying, singular focus. To Mark, that coat represented the system that had stolen his son and accused him of being a monster. "You're not taking him," Mark screamed. Before David could react, Mark lunged. The impact was like being hit by a freight train. David felt the wind rush out of his lungs as his back slammed into the cold, unforgiving concrete. The world tilted. He smelled the scent of grease and wood smoke on Mark's clothes as the man pinned him down, hands bunching into David's collar. "I didn't hurt him," Mark roared, his voice thick with tears. "You people are killing him." David struggled to breathe, the rough asphalt biting into the back of his head. He could see the paramedics pausing, their hands hovering over the gurney. They were confused, looking for security. "Mark, listen to me," David wheezed, grabbing Mark's shaking wrists. "I know you didn't do it. I have the proof." Mark's grip tightened, his knuckles white. "You're lying. You all lie. Ehlers-Danlos," David shouted, the words tearing at his throat. "It's a genetic disorder, Mark. The bruises, they're internal bleeding. Your son's skin is like glass. If they move him now, if they do that biopsy, he'll die. I'm here to stop them, not take him." The words seemed to hang in the air, vibrating against the hum of the ambulance engine. Mark's expression shifted, the murderous rage flickering into a hollow, haunting confusion. He looked down at David, then at the folder clutched in David's hand. The rhythmic click-clack of the riverstone in David's pocket, a habit he didn't even realize he was doing, seemed to ground him. He needed Mark to see the truth. "Look at the file," David pleaded, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I found the markers. You're innocent, Mark. But we have to stop them. Now." Mark's hands began to tremble even more violently, but the pressure on David's chest eased. He slowly let go of David's coat, falling back onto his haunches, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked like a man who had been fighting a ghost and had finally seen a glimpse of solid ground. David didn't waste a second. He scrambled to his feet, his knees stinging from the fall, and ran toward the paramedics who were now closing the ambulance doors. "Hold! Physician's override." David held up the folder like a shield. The lead medic, a young man named Robert Chen, looked at David with wide, darting eyes. Robert was an avoider. He hated conflict. He looked at the folder, then at the hospital doors, then back at David. "We have orders from the state, Doc," Robert said, his voice shaky. "We're behind schedule." "The orders are based on a false diagnosis," David said, forcing a calm he didn't feel. "This folder contains a corrective genetic report. If you proceed with the biopsy at the state facility, the patient will suffer a catastrophic vascular event. You hand this to the receiving surgeon. You tell them factor 4 deficiency. Do you understand?" David shoved the folder into Robert's gloved hands. The medic took it tentatively, as if it were a live grenade. Just take it," David urged. "Save the boy." Robert nodded once, a quick, jerky motion, and climbed into the back of the ambulance. The doors slammed shut with a heavy, metallic thud that echoed through the loading dock. David stood there, chest heaving, watching the red taillights fade as the vehicle pulled away. He felt a fleeting moment of victory. a warmth in his chest that suggested he might have finally been fast enough to stop the water from rising. But the warmth died instantly when the heavy loading dock elevator groaned to life. The doors slid open to reveal Jennifer Sterling. She stood perfectly still, a razor-sharp bob framing a face that was as unmoving as marble. She wore a monochromatic charcoal power suit that seemed to absorb the dim light of the dock. She didn't look at Mark, who was still slumped against a pillar. She looked only at David. "The architecture of a lie is a very fragile thing, David," she said, her voice a low, operatic purr that carried clearly through the damp air. David straightened his glasses, his fingers brushing the bridge of his nose. "It's not a lie, Jennifer. The genetic report is conclusive. Leo Taylor has EDS. The state's case is built on a phantom." Jennifer stepped out of the elevator, her heels clicking against the concrete with the precision of a metronome. She stopped exactly 3 feet from him, invading his personal space. She smelled of expensive perfume and the faint, ozonic scent of a sterilized office. "We are in the middle of a $40 million federal grant cycle, David," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a razor blade against his skin. "That grant is predicated on our trauma center's efficiency and our impeccable record with state-mandated protocols. A high-profile misdiagnosis of child abuse. A scandal involving suppressed evidence. That doesn't just cost us a grant. It collapses the foundation of this entire institution." "You knew," David said, the realization hitting him like a physical weight. "You saw the preliminary markers days ago. You suppressed the report." Jennifer tilted her head, a predatory movement. "We made a structural decision. The boy is one variable. The hospital is a permanent monument. I won't let your eccentricities tear down what I've built." She reached out and plucked the ID badge from David's coat with a sharp, practiced motion. "You're on administrative leave, effective immediately. Security is on their way to escort you from the premises." "And David?" She leaned in closer, her eyes unblinking. "Don't bother looking for that folder you gave the medic. My people are very efficient at cleaning up spills." The transition from the hospital's interior to the cold reality of the parking garage felt like falling through ice. 2 security guards, men with thick necks and eyes like flat stones, walked on either side of David. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence was a physical pressure, punctuated only by the rhythmic thud-thud of their heavy boots. They led him to the main exit of the garage, where the fluorescent lights hummed with that same nauseating B-flat. David felt a hollow ache in his gut. He had handed the folder to Robert Chen, believing it was the key to Leo's survival. But Jennifer's words haunted him. "My people are very efficient." As the guards watched him walk toward his car, a 10-year-old sedan that looked out of place among the luxury SUVs of the senior staff, David's mind raced. He needed to verify the folder. He needed to know if Robert had actually kept it. He reached his car and fumbled for his keys. His hands were shaking so violently, he dropped them. As he bent to pick them up, he noticed something odd about the way the car was sitting. It was too low. He looked down. All 4 of his tires had been slashed, the rubber gaping open like jagged mouths. "Damn it," he hissed, the sound disappearing into the vast, empty space of the garage. He looked up at the windshield. Tucked under the wiper blade was a single sheet of paper. He pulled it out, his fingers trembling. It wasn't a medical form. It was a handwritten note, the ink slightly smeared by the humidity. "Let the boy die, or you die first." The threat was so blunt, so devoid of artifice, that it made the air in the garage feel even colder. David looked around, his heart hammering against his ribs. The low ceilings and thick concrete pillars created 1,000 blind spots. Every shadow seemed to move. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the roar of an engine. A dark SUV, its headlights off, lurched from behind a pillar 50 yards away. The tires shrieked against the smooth concrete as it accelerated toward him. David stood frozen for a heartbeat. The old childhood paralysis. The same one that had kept him on the bank of the creek while his brother drowned, threatening to take hold. "Don't be slow." His father's voice echoed in his head. David lunged to the left, diving behind a massive concrete support column just as the SUV tore past. The side mirror clipped the concrete with a sharp crack, sending shards of plastic flying. The driver didn't stop. They slammed on the brakes, the vehicle fishtailing as they prepared for another pass. David didn't wait. He scrambled toward the nearest exit, but he knew he wouldn't make it to the street on foot. He saw a heavy steel door labeled "Elevator Service, Authorized Personnel Only." He threw his weight against the door. It was locked. The SUV was turning, the engine a predatory growl echoing off the low ceiling. David reached into his pocket and pulled out the Riverstone, rubbing it once, twice, 3 times. He looked at the door handle. It was a standard lever lock. He took his heavy medical clipboard, the one Jennifer hadn't managed to seize, and jammed the metal corner into the gap between the door and the frame. He heaved with everything he had. The metal groaned, a screeching protest that set his teeth on edge. With a final, violent pop, the latch gave way. David tumbled into the dark service corridor just as the SUV's headlights illuminated the spot where he had been standing. He slammed the doors shut and slid the manual bolt. He stood in the dark, smelling the scent of old grease and wet stone, his breath coming in ragged sobs. He was a doctor, a man of science and order, and now he was a fugitive in his own city. By 8 a.m., the sun was a harsh, unforgiving glare reflecting off the glass towers of downtown. David sat in a booth at a secluded diner 3 blocks from the courthouse. The air smelled of burnt coffee and maple syrup, a domestic scent that felt like a mockery of his situation. Across from him sat James Wilson, the Taylor family's defense attorney. Wilson looked the part of a successful lawyer, expensive suit, perfectly groomed hair. But David noticed the sweat on the man's upper lip and the way he kept looking at the door. "You're late, David," Wilson said, his voice rising at the end of the sentence like a question. "I was busy not being murdered in a parking garage," David snapped. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on Wilson's. "Did you get the message? The genetic report? I have a digital backup, but I need you to file an emergency injunction to stop the biopsy. We have hours, James. Maybe less." Wilson sighed, a heavy, dramatic sound. He pulled a thick envelope from his briefcase and laid it on the table. "The state is moving fast, David. They've already scheduled the preliminary hearing for this afternoon. And Jennifer Sterling, she's been talking to the board. They're questioning your mental stability." "Of course they are," David said, his voice tight. "It's a classic demolition, but the data doesn't lie. Look at the markers." He pushed a printed sheet across the table. Wilson didn't look at it. Instead, he looked at his watch. "I've been talking to the hospital's legal team," Wilson said, his voice dropping. "They're offering a deal. If Mark Taylor pleads guilty to a lesser charge of negligence, they'll ensure he gets a suspended sentence. He can keep his parental rights, provided he agrees to the state's medical plan for Leo." David felt a cold prickle of unease. "The state's plan is the biopsy, James. That's what's killing him. Why would you even suggest a plea deal when we have proof of his innocence?" Wilson wouldn't meet his eyes. He began to crack his knuckles one by one, a rhythmic pop, pop, pop that reminded David of a death knell. "The architecture of the case is complicated," Wilson said. "A trial would take months. Leo needs care now." David stared at him. He noticed a small detail, a gold lapel pin on Wilson's jacket. It was the logo of the Sterling Foundation. The truth hit David like a physical blow. He felt the world tilt, the diner's chatter fading into a dull roar. "You're on her payroll," David whispered. Jennifer didn't just suppress the report. She bought the defense. Wilson finally looked at him, and for a second, David saw a flicker of genuine shame in the man's eyes. But it was quickly replaced by the practiced mask of a professional. "I'm doing what's best for the client's stability," Wilson said. "You're killing the client," David roared, slamming his hand onto the table. A nearby waitress jumped, dropping a spoon with a metallic clang. "I think you should leave, David," Wilson said, his voice now cold and certain. "The hospital has filed a restraining order. If you show up at that hearing, you'll be arrested. I can't help you if you won't help yourself." David stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. He didn't say another word. He couldn't. The betrayal was so absolute it left him breathless. He turned and walked out of the diner, the bell above the door ringing with a cheerful, mocking sound. He was alone. No license, no car, no lawyer. And somewhere in a sterile ward, a 4-year-old boy was counting the seconds till a needle would tear his world apart. The private research lab was located in a nondescript brick building on the edge of the industrial district. It was a facility David had used for years for his independent research, a place far removed from Jennifer Sterling's corporate reach. Or so he hoped. The air inside was chemically manufactured and too clean, chilled to a constant 62 degrees. David's breath misted in the air as he moved down the darkened hallway. His fingers were already going numb, making it difficult to handle the stolen keycard he'd swiped from the lab manager's desk weeks ago, just in case. He reached the cryogenic storage unit in the back of the lab. The machine hummed with a deep, rhythmic throb. He punched in his code, his heart hammering in his throat. Click. The heavy drawer slid open with a hiss of nitrogen. There, nestled in a bed of white frost, was the secondary blood sample he'd drawn from Leo 3 days ago. It was a small glass vial, the red liquid inside dark and precious. It was the only physical evidence left. David reached for it, his fingers closing around the cold glass. Suddenly, the lights flared to life, a blinding, aggressive white that made him wince. "You really are a persistent variable, aren't you, Doctor?" David spun around. Standing in the doorway was Marcus Thorne, the hospital's head of security. Thorne was a man built like a tree trunk, with a buzz cut and a neck that looked like it could withstand a sledgehammer. He held a tactical baton in one hand, the black metal gleaming under the lights. David looked around the lab. For the first time, he noticed the devastation. The centrifuges had been overturned, their glass lids shattered. The computers had been smashed, their screens spider-webbed. The entire facility had been ransacked. "You're too late," Thorne said, his voice a flat, emotionless rasp. "We've already cleaned the data." "I have the sample," David said, holding the vial aloft. "This is all I need. The markers don't change just because you break a few monitors." Thorne smiled, a slow, cruel movement of his lips. He stepped into the room, his heavy boots crunching on the broken glass. "You don't have anything but a trespassing charge and a very bleak future," Thorne said. He lunged. David tried to duck, but Thorne was faster. The baton caught David in the ribs with a sickening thud. David gasped, the pain a white-hot flare that stole his breath. He stumbled back, his shoulder hitting a metal workbench. Thorne was on him in an instant, pinning him against the bench. The heavy baton pressed against David's throat, cutting off his air. David clawed at Thorne's arms, his fingers useless against the man's muscle. "Jennifer wants you to understand something," Thorne whispered, leaning in close. David could smell the scent of peppermint and gun oil. "Order is more important than truth. You're a glitch, David, and I'm the delete key." David's vision began to gray at the edges. He looked down at the workbench. His hand brushed against something heavy, a small portable centrifuge that had survived the initial destruction. With a final, desperate surge of strength, David grabbed the machine and swung it with everything he had. The heavy metal base caught Thorne in the side of the head. There was a dull, wet thwack. Thorne's eyes rolled back, and his grip on David's throat loosened. The big man slumped to the floor, his baton clattering away. David collapsed against the bench, gasping for air, his lungs burning. He stayed there for a moment, the silence of the lab broken only by the hum of the broken equipment. Then he looked down. His hand was empty. The vial had fallen during the struggle. It lay on the concrete floor, shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. The dark red blood, the last piece of physical evidence, was a jagged stain on the gray concrete, soaking into the dust. "No," David whispered, his voice a broken sob. "No, no, no." He fell to his knees, his hands hovering over the mess. He tried to scoop it up, but the liquid was already gone, lost to the porous floor. He had been too slow. Again. The pre-trial hearing room was small and oppressive, the dark wood paneling seeming to absorb all the light. David sat in the back row, his ribs bandaged and his spirit shattered. He was a shadow of the man who had walked into the lab a few hours ago. At the front of the room, Dr. Aris, the state-appointed foster doctor, was testifying. Aris was a man who spoke in questions, his rising inflection making everything sound like a gentle suggestion rather than a medical opinion. "The patient's vitals are stable," Aris said, looking at the judge. "We've performed a series of preliminary tests, and we see no evidence of the systemic fragility Dr. Miller described. In fact, the boy seems quite resilient." Aris clicked a remote, and a series of fabricated medical charts appeared on the screen. The numbers were perfect. Too perfect. They showed a healthy 4-year-old with no genetic anomalies. "It is our opinion," Aris continued, "that Dr. Miller's diagnosis was a result of professional exhaustion, perhaps a personal obsession with the case that clouded his judgment." David wanted to scream. He wanted to stand up and shout that the charts were a lie, that Aris was a puppet. But he knew it would only play into their narrative. He was the unstable doctor. The judge, a woman with sharp eyes and a mouth like a thin line, turned to the bailiff. "Is Dr. Miller in the room?" David felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He turned to see a police officer standing behind him. "David Miller," the officer whispered. "You're under arrest for assault and trespassing. I also have an active restraining order against you for the Taylor family." The officer pulled David's hands behind his back. The metallic click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound in the world. As he was led out of the courtroom, David saw Jennifer Sterling sitting in the front row. She didn't turn around, but she hummed a low, familiar tune. "Happy birthday." The final day of the hearing arrived like a funeral. David was led into the courtroom in handcuffs, his orange jumpsuit a glaring mark of his fall from grace. The gallery was packed, reporters, hospital staff, and the Taylor family. who looked at David with a mix of fear and confusion. Jennifer Sterling sat at the prosecution table, her silver hair gleaming. She looked like the victor. David was called to the stand as a hostile witness. He walked slowly, the chains around his ankles clanking against the floor. He took the oath with a steady voice, his eyes fixed on the judge. "Dr. Miller," the prosecutor said, "you've claimed that Leo Taylor is in imminent danger. Yet every medical professional the state has consulted says otherwise. How do you explain that?" David adjusted his glasses with his cuffed hands. He looked at the monitor on the wall, the one used for displaying evidence. "I can't explain their silence," David said, his voice calm and precise. "But I can show you the truth. If the court permits, I'd like to access the hospital's public safety dashboard. It's a live feed of patient vitals used for transparency and PR." The prosecutor laughed. "What does a PR dashboard have to do with this?" "It's live data," David said, "unfiltered by administrative overrides. Leo Taylor is currently in room 404. If you pull up his vitals now, you'll see the architecture of a collapse." The judge hesitated, then nodded to the technician. "Display the feed." The screen flickered, then filled with a grid of numbers. In the center was room 404. The heart rate monitor was a jagged, frantic line. It was spiking, 140, 150, 160 beats per minute. The blood pressure was plummeting. "That's a tachycardia event," David said, his voice rising. "His internal organs are hemorrhaging. The stable condition Dr. Aris described was a lie. The boy is dying. Right now." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Mark Taylor stood up, screaming his son's name. Jennifer Sterling's face finally cracked, her eyes wide with a sudden, sharp terror. "Recess," the judge shouted, banging her gavel. "Get a medical team to that room." But David knew the hospital team wouldn't be fast enough. Not with Jennifer's people in the way. As the guards tried to lead him away, David lunged forward. He used his shoulder to knock the guard off balance and sprinted toward the side exit, the one leading to the hallway where the transport teams moved patients between the courthouse and the hospital wing. He burst into the hallway and saw the gurney. Leo was there, his face the color of ash, his chest heaving. Robert Chen was standing over him, frozen in indecision. "He's not breathing," Robert shouted. "I don't know what to do." David skidded to a halt beside the gurney. He didn't have his tools, he didn't have his license, but he had his hands. "Give me your kit," David roared. He grabbed a large bore needle from Robert's bag. He didn't wait for permission. He felt for the space between Leo's ribs, his fingers precise and steady despite the chaos. "Don't be slow." He plunged the needle into the boy's chest. There was a sharp hiss of escaping air, the sound of a life being saved. Leo's chest rose, a deep, shuddering breath that filled the hallway. The heart monitor's frantic beeping began to slow, settling into a rhythmic, beautiful cadence. David slumped against the wall, the needle still in his hand. He looked up to see Jennifer Sterling standing at the end of the hallway, flanked by security. But they didn't move. The reporters were there, their cameras flashing, capturing the moment of the disgraced doctor saving the boy the hospital had abandoned. 2 weeks later, David sat on a bench in a small park across from the hospital. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and the faint, sweet scent of blooming jasmine. He wasn't wearing a lab coat. He was wearing a simple sweater, his hands tucked into his pockets. He felt the river stone against his palm. He rubbed it once. Just once. A shadow fell over him. He looked up to see Mark Taylor and Leo. The boy was in a wheelchair, his skin still pale but his eyes bright and curious. He was holding a toy stethoscope, the plastic tubing bright red. "Dr. David?" Leo whispered. "Hey, Leo," David said, a genuine smile touching his lips. Mark stepped forward, his hand extended. His grip was firm, the calluses of a working man a testament to his resilience. "They dropped the charges," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. "And Sterling, she's being indicted for fraud and endangerment. They found the files, David. All of them." "I heard," David said. "And your license?" Mark asked, his brow furrowing. David looked at the hospital, the white walls gleaming in the afternoon sun. "It's gone. The board decided my unorthodox methods were a liability. I'm not a doctor anymore." Mark looked down at his son, then back at David. "You'll always be a healer to us." Leo reached out and handed the toy stethoscope to David. "For you, so you can hear the hearts." David took the toy, the plastic warm from the boy's hand. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't known since he was 10 years old. He had lost his career, his reputation, and his title. But as he watched Leo count the pigeons on the grass, 1, 2, 3, David realized he had finally outrun the water. He was no longer a man of science or a man of the system. He was just a man who had been fast enough. And for the first time in his life, that was enough.